The mahogany-paneled chambers of the Supreme Court felt suffocating as Dr. Amelia Washington spread the case files across her desk like pieces of a disturbing puzzle. The morning light streaming through the tall windows illuminated stack after stack of appeals from the Manhattan Federal Courthouse, each one telling the same story in different words. Black defendants receiving sentences that averaged 40% longer than their white counterparts for identical charges. The statistics were undeniable, yet buried beneath layers of legal procedure and bureaucratic language that made them nearly invisible to casual observation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 53, Amelia had earned her position through decades of brilliant legal work and unwavering commitment to justice. Her appointment as the first Black woman to the Supreme Court had been historic, but it also made her acutely aware of the weight of expectation she carried. Every decision she made was scrutinized not just for its legal merit, but as a reflection of whether she truly belonged in the highest court in the land. Her phone rang, interrupting her analysis. The caller ID showed a Manhattan number she didn't recognize. "Justice Washington?" she answered formally. "Justice Washington, this is David Chen. I'm a public defender at the Manhattan Federal Court." The voice was young, strained with exhaustion and frustration. "I'm sorry to call you directly, but I didn't know where else to turn. Something's very wrong here, and people are getting hurt." Amelia leaned back in her leather chair, her interest immediately piqued. "What kind of wrong, Mr. Chen?" "It's the bailiffs, the judges, the whole system. Black defendants are being brutalized in ways I've never seen. Yesterday, they threw a teenager against a wall because he asked when his mother could visit. When I objected, they threatened to have me removed from the building permanently." Chen's voice cracked slightly. "I've been practicing law for 3 years, Justice Washington, and I've never felt this helpless. It's like there are 2 different justice systems operating under the same roof." After ending the call 20 minutes later, Amelia stared at the files with new understanding. The numbers weren't just statistics. They represented real people suffering under a system that seemed designed to fail them. She had seen discrimination throughout her career, had faced it personally in countless courtrooms and law firms. But this felt different, more systematic, more deliberately cruel. The knock on her door came precisely at 2 o'clock. Chief Justice Franklin Adams entered with his characteristic measured stride, his silver hair impeccably styled, his expression grave with the burden of leadership he'd carried for the past 8 years. "Amelia, I understand you've been reviewing the Manhattan appeals." "The pattern is unmistakable. This isn't isolated bias, it's institutional discrimination on a massive scale." "I share your concerns, but we must be careful about how we proceed. The court's authority comes from its perceived impartiality. If we're seen as conducting activist investigations, Amelia's voice sharpened. "Franklin, we're talking about fundamental violations of civil rights. How is ensuring equal justice under law activist?" "You know I don't mean it that way. But Senator Brooks and his Judiciary Committee are already questioning several of our recent decisions. If we move too aggressively, we risk a political backlash that could undermine everything we're trying to protect." Amelia stood and walked to the window overlooking the Supreme Court grounds. Below, tourists gathered on the steps, many of them taking photographs beside the words "Equal Justice Under Law" carved in stone above the entrance. The irony wasn't lost on her. "What would you have me do? Sit here in this beautiful chamber while people suffer because of their skin color? My appointment was supposed to mean something, Franklin. If I can't use this position to fight the very discrimination that tried to keep me from reaching it, then what's the point?" Adams joined her at the window. There are proper channels, oversight committees, gradual reforms. Gradual. Amelia turned to face him, her dark eyes flashing with determination. You mean slow enough that we can pretend we're addressing the problem without actually threatening anyone's comfort or power? That's not fair, and you know it. What I know is that while we debate proper channels, people like Mr. Chen are watching teenagers get brutalized in courtrooms because they don't have the right skin color. She returned to her desk and began organizing the files. I'm going to see for myself what's happening in that courthouse. Amelia, please, send investigators, file formal inquiries, work through the system. The system is the problem, Franklin, and sometimes the only way to fix a broken system is to experience it from the perspective of those it's failing. That evening, Amelia sat in her Georgetown townhouse, carefully planning her undercover mission. She had already contacted a law school friend who helped her create a believable cover story. Columbia law student writing a paper on federal court procedures. The fake credentials would pass casual inspection, and her appearance in student attire would render her invisible to those who knew her only in judicial robes. She studied herself in the bedroom mirror as she practiced her cover story. Without her formal attire and judicial bearing, she looked like any other middle-aged black woman navigating the justice system. The thought both saddened and emboldened her. Tomorrow she would experience that system not as Justice Washington, but as just another citizen seeking justice. Her reflections stared back at her, and for a moment she saw not the distinguished Supreme Court justice, but the young law student who had faced discrimination in every classroom, every law firm, every courtroom on her way to this pinnacle of legal authority. That woman had never stopped fighting. Tomorrow she would fight again. The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of the Manhattan Federal Courthouse as Amelia Washington approached the imposing building dressed in dark jeans, a plain white blouse, and a worn leather messenger bag slung across her shoulder. Her usual elegant updo had been replaced by a simple ponytail, and she wore minimal makeup. To the casual observer, she looked like any other graduate student visiting the courthouse for research. The security checkpoint immediately revealed the two-tiered system of justice she had suspected. Amelia watched as a well-dressed white businessman passed through with barely a glance at his briefcase, while the elderly black woman ahead of her was subjected to a thorough bag search and additional screening. Bailiff Marcus Torres manned the checkpoint with military precision, his broad shoulders filling out his uniform, his pale blue eyes scanning each person with calculating assessment. When Amelia's turn came, those eyes hardened noticeably. "Purpose of visit?" Torres demanded, his tone noticeably sharper than he'd used with previous white visitors. "I'm a Columbia law student observing court proceedings for a research paper," Amelia replied calmly, offering her fake credentials. Torres examined the ID with unnecessary thoroughness, holding it up to the light as if checking for counterfeiting. "Step through the scanner. Arms up, feet apart." Amelia complied, noting how the bailiff's colleague, a younger Hispanic officer, watched the interaction with obvious discomfort. The scanner beeped unnecessarily long before Torres waved her through, but not before rifling through her messenger bag with aggressive thoroughness. "Keep that student ID visible at all times," Torres instructed, his hand lingering on his radio as if expecting trouble. "Any disruption, and you're gone." The courthouse interior buzzed with typical morning activity, but Amelia's trained eye immediately spotted the disparities. Court officers clustered near black visitors, monitoring their conversations and movements with suspicious attention. White attorneys moved freely through restricted areas, while their black counterparts were questioned about their presence. "Excuse me, are you here for the Chen case?" Amelia looked up to see a slight Asian-American man in an ill-fitting suit approaching her bench. His dark hair was disheveled. His eyes showed the exhaustion of someone fighting a losing battle daily. "I'm sorry, I don't—" "David Chen," he said, extending his hand. "Public defender. I called you yesterday, just as—"
I called someone about the situation here. You look familiar." Amelia's pulse quickened, but she maintained her composure. "I'm just a law student, Mr. Chen, but I'd be very interested in hearing about your experiences here for my research." Chen glanced around nervously before sitting beside her. "It's getting worse every week. The bailiffs have been given carte blanche to use whatever force they deem necessary to maintain order, but their definition of order seems to depend entirely on skin color." As if summoned by their conversation, Torres appeared beside their bench. "Mr. Chen, your client's hearing has been moved up. Judge Holbrook wants to see you immediately." Chen stood quickly. "Thank you, Officer Torres. I'll be right there." "Immediately means now, not when you finish chatting with your friend." Amelia bristled at Torres's dismissive tone, but Chen simply gathered his papers and hurried toward the courtroom. She followed at a distance, taking a seat in the public gallery of Courtroom 7. Judge Patricia Holbrook presided with an air of imperial authority, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, her reading glasses perched on her nose like a weapon of intellectual superiority. At 65, she commanded the courtroom through calculated intimidation rather than earned respect.
The case before her involved a young black man charged with drug possession, a minor offense that should have resulted in probation or community service. But as Amelia watched, Judge Holbrook systematically excluded evidence that would have benefited the defendant while allowing questionable prosecution evidence to stand. "Mr. Chen," Judge Holbrook said, her voice dripping with disdain, "your client's Fourth Amendment motion is denied. The search was conducted properly according to established procedure." Chen stood. "Your Honor, with respect, the officer had no reasonable suspicion to justify—" "Mr. Chen," Torres interrupted, moving closer to the defense table. "His Honor has ruled. Sit down." "I have the right to make my argument, Officer Torres." "You have the right to respect this court's decisions." Torres's hand moved to his baton. "That means sitting down when you're told." Judge Holbrook watched the exchange with apparent satisfaction. "Mr. Chen, please control yourself. This outburst is highly inappropriate." Chen's face flushed with frustration, but he remained standing. "Your Honor, my client's constitutional rights." Torres moved swiftly, grasping Chen's arm with unnecessary force. "That's enough disruption for one day." Amelia watched in horror as the bailiff twisted Chen's arm behind his back, causing the young attorney to cry out in pain. The defendant, a 19-year-old named Marcus Johnson, started to rise in protest, but two additional bailiffs immediately restrained him with such violence that blood appeared on his lip. "Officer Torres, please remove Mr. Chen from my courtroom," Judge Holbrook ordered, calmly as if she were requesting coffee. "He can return when he's prepared to behave professionally." The sight of Torres forcing Chen toward the door while other bailiffs brutalized his teenage client shattered Amelia's resolve to remain undercover. This wasn't just discrimination, it was systematic abuse of power designed to terrorize and silence those who couldn't fight back. Everything she had worked for, every barrier she had broken, every precedent she had set in her career led to this moment. She could remain silent and complete her investigation, or she could act immediately to stop the injustice unfolding before her eyes. The choice when it came wasn't really a choice at all. The courtroom had descended into controlled chaos as Torres dragged David Chen toward the exit, while his client Marcus Johnson was pressed face down against the defendant's table by two additional bailiffs. Judge Holbrook observed the brutality with the detached interest of someone watching a mildly entertaining television program. Amelia Washington rose from her seat in the public gallery, her movement swift and decisive. Every instinct told her to remain hidden, to complete her investigation through observation rather than intervention. But watching Torres twist Chen's arm at an angle that clearly caused excruciating pain, seeing blood trickle from Marcus Johnson's nose as officers pressed his face against the wood, triggered something deeper than strategy. "Stop," she said clearly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This level of force is completely unnecessary." The courtroom fell silent except for Chen's labored breathing. Torres released his grip on the public defender's arm and turned to face Amelia, his expression shifting from professional aggression to personal hatred. "Ma'am, sit down and be quiet or you'll be removed from this courtroom."
I will not sit down while you brutalize an attorney trying to represent his client. Amelia moved purposefully down the aisle toward the front of the courtroom. Mr. Chen was making a legitimate legal argument when you assaulted him. Your Honor, Chen gasped, struggling to straighten his twisted arm. This woman is right. I was simply making my Fourth Amendment argument when Officer Torres— Shut up, Torres snarled, shoving Chen backward with such force that the slight attorney stumbled against the counsel table. That push shattered the last of Amelia's restraint. Officer Torres, you have no legal authority to silence an attorney making constitutional arguments. She reached into her messenger bag. I suggest you familiarize yourself with proper courtroom procedure before— But Torres was already moving, his face contorted with rage at being challenged by a black woman who refused to be intimidated. His hand shot out, connecting with Amelia's cheek with a sound that echoed through the suddenly silent courtroom like a gunshot. The force of the blow sent Amelia staggering backward, her messenger bag flying from her shoulder to scatter its contents across the polished floor. Pain exploded across her face as she tasted blood from her split lip. For a moment, the courtroom spun around her as she fought to maintain her balance.
Then she saw it, her Supreme Court identification badge lying among the scattered papers, her official photograph and title clearly visible in the courtroom's harsh fluorescent lighting. Dr. Amelia Washington, Associate Justice, Supreme Court of the United States. The badge might as well have been a nuclear weapon for the reaction it caused. Torres, who had been advancing for another blow, stopped as if he'd walked into an invisible wall, his face drained of color so rapidly that Amelia thought he might collapse. Judge Holbrook half rose from her bench, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly as recognition dawned in her eyes. She had seen Amelia's photograph countless times in legal journals and newspapers, but never imagined she might be sitting in her courtroom disguised as a graduate student. David Chen, despite his injured arm, stared at the ID badge with a mixture of shock and dawning hope. Marcus Johnson, still pinned to the table, craned his neck to see what had caused such a dramatic shift in the room's atmosphere. Amelia straightened slowly, touching her fingertips to her bleeding lip with clinical detachment. She retrieved her badge and held it up for all to see, her voice carrying to every corner of the now tomb-like courtroom. This court is now under direct investigation by the Supreme Court of the United States, she announced, her words sharp and clear despite her swollen lip. Dr. Torres, you have just assaulted a sitting Supreme Court justice in the commission of her duties. Torres's hand, still raised from striking her, began to tremble visibly. Judge Holbrook, Amelia continued, turning her gaze to the bench where the older woman sat frozen in horror. I am hereby assuming authority over these proceedings. You will vacate the bench immediately. Justice Washington, this is highly irregular, Holbrook stammered, her usual commanding presence completely shattered. What's irregular, Your Honor, is allowing bailiffs to brutalize attorneys and defendants in your courtroom while you watch with apparent approval. Amelia moved toward the bench, her presence suddenly commanding despite her casual attire and injured face. What's irregular is the systematic discrimination I've witnessed in this courthouse for the past 2 hours. She climbed the steps to the judge's bench as Holbrook reluctantly surrendered her seat, the older woman's face pale with the realization that her career was likely ending in this moment. Amelia settled behind the bench and turned her attention to Torres, who stood paralyzed with shock, his fellow bailiffs backing away from him as if his assault on a Supreme Court justice might be contagious. Dr. Torres, she said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of ultimate judicial authority. You are about to learn exactly what happens when you mistake brute force for justice. The courtroom remained utterly silent as Amelia Washington, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States,
took control of a system that had revealed its true nature through violence. Her presence behind the bench transformed the entire dynamic of the room, shifting power from those who had abused it to someone who understood its proper purpose. Outside, word of the unprecedented events was beginning to spread through the courthouse like wildfire. A Supreme Court justice had been assaulted by a bailiff, had assumed control of a courtroom, and was conducting an investigation that would shake the federal court system to its foundation. The reckoning had begun. The emergency meeting convened in Judge Patricia Holbrook's chambers 20 minutes after Amelia Washington's shocking revelation in Courtroom 7. The mahogany-paneled office, usually a sanctuary of judicial dignity, now buzzed with panic as courthouse officials scrambled to contain what they all recognized as a potential career-ending disaster. Robert Sterling, the federal court administrator, paced behind Holbrook's desk like a caged animal, his normally perfect hair disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled from stress. At 58, Sterling had built his career on maintaining the courthouse's pristine reputation and protecting powerful interests. Today's events were threatening to destroy everything he had carefully constructed over 2 decades. "This is containable," Sterling declared, although his voice lacked conviction. Justice Washington was clearly operating outside her authority. No federal judge has the right to conduct unauthorized investigations. We'll frame this as judicial overreach. Judge Holbrook sat slumped in her chair, her usual imperious bearing replaced by the hollow expression of someone watching their world collapse. "Robert, she's a Supreme Court justice. The woman has ultimate judicial authority in this country." "Not over individual federal courts," Sterling insisted, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling Senator Brooks immediately. He chairs the Judiciary Committee. If we get ahead of this narrative—" The door burst open without a knock, revealing Marcus Torres, flanked by 2 fellow bailiffs.
"She's ordered federal marshals," Torres reported, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're on their way from the Southern District Office. Justice Washington is securing all courthouse records and footage." Sterling's face darkened. "The security footage from today needs to be reviewed for technical issues. Sometimes files become corrupted, especially during system maintenance." "Are you suggesting we tamper with evidence?" Holbrook asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "I'm suggesting we protect this institution from a rogue Supreme Court justice who assaulted our personnel and disrupted legal proceedings," Sterling replied smoothly. "Officer Torres was maintaining courtroom order when he was attacked by an unidentified woman who refused to follow lawful commands." The lies flowed so easily that Torres almost believed them himself. But the memory of his hand connecting with Justice Washington's face, the sound of the impact, the taste of his own fear when her badge scattered across the floor, these physical realities couldn't be altered by Sterling's spin. Meanwhile, in Courtroom 7, Amelia maintained her position behind the bench as federal marshals began arriving. The first to enter was Deputy Marshal Patricia Santos, a compact woman with steel gray hair and the bearing of someone who had seen every form of corruption the federal system could produce. "Justice Washington?" Santos approached the bench with professional deference. "We received your emergency request. What's the situation?" "Deputy Santos, this courthouse is operating under systematic discrimination that violates federal civil rights law. I need immediate preservation of all security footage, case files, and financial records. No information leaves this building without my direct authorization." Santos nodded crisply. "Understood. We'll establish a perimeter and secure all evidence. Should we expect resistance from courthouse administration?" Before Amelia could answer,
Her phone buzzed with a call from her daughter. Isabella's voice, tight with concern, came through clearly. "Mom, what's happening? I'm seeing news alerts about federal marshals at Manhattan Federal Court. Please tell me you're safe." "Isabella, I need you in New York immediately. Bring our litigation team and prepare for a full civil rights investigation. This is bigger than we initially suspected." "I'm already packing. Flight leaves in 2 hours." Isabella's voice shifted to professional mode. "Mom, the media is going crazy. Someone leaked footage of the incident. It's all over social media." Amelia glanced at the young man with the smartphone near the back of the courtroom. David Chen, still nursing his twisted arm, had apparently live-streamed the entire confrontation. The footage of Torres striking a Supreme Court justice was now circulating globally, making Sterling's damage control efforts futile. "Good," Amelia said firmly. "Transparency will protect us better than secrecy. See you tonight." As evening approached, the courthouse had transformed into a federal crime scene. Marshals secured every computer, every file cabinet, every recording device. Sterling found his administrative authority completely overruled by Justice Washington's federal warrants, while Torres and his fellow bailiffs were confined to a conference room pending formal interviews. The media circus outside grew by the hour. News vans lined the street. Satellite dishes pointed skyward like metallic flowers seeking the sun. Reporters shouted questions at anyone entering or leaving the building, while social media exploded with commentary, analysis, and increasingly viral footage of the assault. Judge Holbrook, realizing her position had become untenable, attempted one final political maneuver. She placed a call to Circuit Judge William Morrison, her longtime mentor and political ally. "Bill, I need damage control. This Washington woman has completely overstepped her authority. She's conducting some kind of rogue investigation based on a misunderstanding." Morrison's response chilled her blood. "Patricia, I just watched the footage. That bailiff struck a sitting Supreme Court justice in open court while she was trying to stop him from brutalizing a public defender. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is a federal civil rights violation that's about to bring down everyone associated with it." By 10 o'clock that night, Isabella Washington Santos had arrived at the courthouse with a team of civil rights attorneys from the Southern Poverty Law Center. At 28, Isabella possessed her mother's brilliant legal mind, but channeled it through grassroots activism rather than judicial restraint. "Mom, the footage is incredible," Isabella said as they hugged in Amelia's temporary command post. "Torres hitting you, your badge falling to the floor, that moment of recognition, it's like watching the entire system of white supremacy collapse in real time." Amelia winced at her daughter's characteristically direct language. "Isabella, please. This isn't about white supremacy. It's about institutional discrimination and the abuse of authority."
"Those are the same thing, Mom. You just use polite legal language to describe it." Isabella spread out legal documents across the conference table. "I've already filed emergency injunctions to prevent any destruction of evidence. Sterling and his people are trapped." As mother and daughter worked through the night, preparing for what they both knew would be the legal battle of their careers, Robert Sterling sat in his office making increasingly desperate phone calls. Each conversation revealed how quickly powerful allies could abandon those who became liabilities. Senator William Brooks, initially supportive, had grown cold after viewing the assault footage. "Robert, I can't be associated with this. A Supreme Court justice was attacked in federal court. This is political poison." Corporate contacts at private prison companies suddenly couldn't return his calls. Political donors discovered prior commitments that prevented meetings. The network Sterling had spent decades building evaporated in less than 24 hours. The transformation was swift and merciless. By dawn, Sterling realized that his only hope for survival lay in complete cooperation with Justice Washington's investigation. The alternative was criminal prosecution for obstruction of justice and civil rights violations. But for Amelia Washington, sitting behind the bench she had claimed through moral authority rather than official assignment, The real work was just beginning. The assault had revealed the surface of a much deeper corruption, and she intended to expose every layer of systematic discrimination that had flourished in the shadows of American justice. 3 days after the dramatic confrontation, the Manhattan Federal Courthouse had become the epicenter of the most comprehensive civil rights investigation in decades. Federal marshals maintained security, while teams of investigators combed through years of case files, financial records, and electronic communications. The building's normally staid atmosphere buzzed with the intensity of a military operation. Amelia established her temporary headquarters in the courthouse's main conference room, which she had transformed into a command center, complete with computers, evidence boards, and secure communication equipment. The space resembled a war room more than a judicial chamber, reflecting the magnitude of the systematic corruption she was uncovering. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria Gonzalez, the court reporter who had witnessed years of discriminatory practices while remaining professionally invisible, approached Amelia's team with a small digital recorder clutched in her trembling hands. "Justice Washington," Maria said quietly, glancing around nervously, "I've been recording everything for 3 years. I knew someday someone would need to hear the truth." At 42, Maria had worked as a court reporter for 15 years, her quiet competence making her nearly invisible to the judges and attorneys whose words she transcribed. Single mother of 2 teenage daughters, she had remained silent about the discrimination she witnessed daily, knowing that speaking out could cost her the job she desperately needed. But watching Torres strike a Supreme Court justice while Judge Holbrook sat passively had shattered her ability to remain silent. Isabella Washington Santos reviewed the recordings with growing amazement and horror. The digital files contained hundreds of hours of conversations that judges believed were private, chambers discussions, sidebar conferences, and casual comments that revealed the systematic nature of the courthouse's discriminatory practices. "Listen to this one," Isabella said, connecting the recorder to the speakers in the conference room. Judge Holbrook's voice filled the space with startling clarity. "These public defenders act like every drug dealer from Harlem deserves the same consideration as some college kid who made a mistake. We know the difference between defendants with potential and career criminals. I'm just saving everyone time by acknowledging statistical reality." The recording continued with Judge Morrison agreeing enthusiastically. "Exactly right, Patricia. The bleeding hearts don't understand that some people are simply more likely to reoffend. Our job is protecting society, not coddling criminals who will be back in 6 months anyway." Amelia listened with controlled fury as the recordings revealed not just individual bias, but coordinated discrimination disguised as practical efficiency. The judges had created an entire philosophy that justified treating black defendants differently while maintaining plausible deniability. Further investigation revealed the financial infrastructure that supported the discriminatory system. David Chen, working as a volunteer investigator despite his injured arm, discovered payments from Meridian Correctional Corporation, a private prison company, to a consulting firm owned by Judge Holbrook's brother-in-law. "Justice Washington, look at this pattern," Chen said, spreading financial documents across the conference table. "Meridian pays the consulting firm quarterly bonuses that directly correlate with incarceration rates. When more black defendants receive prison sentences, the payments increase." The private prison connection explained the systematic nature of the discrimination. Longer sentences for black defendants meant higher profits for Meridian, which shared those profits through carefully disguised consulting arrangements. The judges weren't just expressing personal bias, they were participating in a criminal enterprise. Isabella discovered similar financial relationships connecting other federal judges to private prison corporations. The corruption extended beyond Manhattan to courthouse systems across multiple districts, all feeding defendants into privately owned facilities that profited from human captivity. "This is a nationwide conspiracy," Isabella reported to her mother during their evening strategy session. "We're not dealing with isolated courthouse bias. This is a coordinated system designed to criminalize black Americans for corporate profit." As evidence mounted, courthouse employees began coming forward with their own testimonies. Clerks revealed how they had been instructed to route black defendants to specific judges known for harsh sentencing. Security officers admitted to targeting black citizens for additional screening and harassment. Even maintenance staff described being told to report suspicious behavior by black visitors while ignoring identical behavior by white visitors. The most damning evidence came from Robert Sterling's computer files, which federal investigators accessed through warrant. Sterling had maintained detailed spreadsheets tracking incarceration rates by demographic categories, with quarterly goals for maintaining what he euphemistically called appropriate demographic balance in the federal correctional system. One email exchange between Sterling and Senator Brooks revealed the political protection that enabled the discriminatory system to flourish. Sterling: Senator, the Washington investigation could expose our efficiency improvements at Manhattan Federal. We need congressional support to frame this as judicial overreach. Brooks: Understood. I'll schedule hearings questioning Justice Washington's conduct. We must protect the integrity of federal court administration from activist judges. The correspondence proved that Senator Brooks was not just aware of the discriminatory practices, but actively working to protect them from exposure. His presidential ambitions depended on maintaining a reputation for supporting law and order, which required high conviction rates regardless of civil rights violations. Amelia realized that the corruption she was uncovering reached beyond a single courthouse. The systematic discrimination at Manhattan Federal Court was part of a national network that included federal judges, prison corporations, and political figures who profited from the mass incarceration of black Americans. Late one evening, as she reviewed the expanding evidence, Amelia received a visitor who would change the direction of her investigation entirely. Chief Justice Franklin Adams arrived unannounced, his usually composed demeanor replaced by obvious distress. "Amelia, we need to talk privately," Adams said, glancing around the evidence-filled conference room. "What you're uncovering goes deeper than you realize. There are Supreme Court implications that could threaten the entire federal judiciary." Adams revealed that preliminary investigation had identified financial connections between private prison corporations and judicial conferences, legal education programs, and even Supreme Court administrative services. The corruption wasn't limited to lower federal courts, it reached into the highest levels of American jurisprudence. "How long have you known?" Amelia asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Suspected for months, known for certain since yesterday," Adams replied heavily. "Amelia, if we expose this completely, we risk destroying public faith in the entire judicial system. The Supreme Court's legitimacy depends on the perception that we're above this kind of corruption." Amelia stood at the window overlooking the courthouse steps, where protesters had gathered in support of her investigation. Signs reading "Justice for All" and "End Judicial Racism" filled the street, while news crews captured the growing movement that her revelation had sparked. "Franklin, our legitimacy depends on actually being above this corruption, not just appearing to be. If the Supreme Court's reputation can only survive by covering up systematic civil rights violations, then maybe that reputation isn't worth preserving." The scope of the investigation had expanded beyond anything Amelia had initially imagined. What began as documentation of courthouse discrimination had revealed a national conspiracy that challenged the very foundations of American justice. The evidence was overwhelming, but so were the forces arrayed against its exposure. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room buzzed with tension as Senator William Brooks called the emergency session to order. Television cameras captured every angle of the ornate chamber where Supreme Court nominations were typically debated, but today's proceedings would determine whether a sitting justice could be disciplined for her investigation of judicial corruption. Brooks, impeccably dressed in a navy suit that projected authority and moral certainty, had spent 3 days preparing for this moment. At 56, with silver-streaked hair and the commanding presence that marked successful politicians, he understood that his presidential ambitions depended on successfully discrediting Justice Washington while appearing to defend judicial integrity. Amelia sat at the witness table, flanked by Isabella and her legal team, her expression composed despite the hostile atmosphere. She wore her judicial robes as a reminder of her authority, though she knew Brooks intended to strip her of that protection through public humiliation.
"Senator Brooks," Amelia said when recognized to speak, "I exercised my constitutional authority to investigate systematic violations of civil rights in the federal court system. The evidence we've uncovered—" "Justice Washington," Brooks interrupted, "you disguised yourself as a student, infiltrated a federal courthouse under false pretenses, and provoked a confrontation with court security. These are not the actions of a responsible jurist." The hearing room erupted as protesters in the gallery shouted their support for Justice Washington. Brooks gavelled for order while security officers moved to remove the demonstrators, creating the kind of chaos that television audiences would remember long after the legal arguments were forgotten. Isabella leaned toward her mother, whispering urgently, "He's trying to make you look unstable. Don't let him control the narrative." But Brooks had prepared more than legal arguments. His staff had spent 72 hours constructing a comprehensive attack designed to destroy Amelia's credibility through personal rather than professional criticism. "Justice Washington, this committee has received reports about your family's financial arrangements," Brooks continued once order was restored. "Specifically, your daughter's law firm has received substantial donations from organizations that benefit from your activist judicial philosophy." Isabella's face flushed with anger, but Amelia placed a restraining hand on her arm. This was exactly the kind of personal attack that Brooks hoped would provoke an emotional response. "Senator Brooks, my daughter's law firm represents civil rights victims pro bono. Any donations support their advocacy for constitutional principles that you seem to find threatening." "Constitutional principles? Or a radical agenda that seeks to undermine law enforcement and judicial authority?" Brooks shot back. "Justice Washington, your investigation has caused chaos in federal courts across the country. Judges are afraid to make tough sentencing decisions for fear of being labeled racist by your task force." The accusation was false, but Brooks knew that public perception mattered more than accuracy. His staff had coordinated with friendly media outlets to amplify stories about judges feeling intimidated by Justice Washington's investigation, creating the impression that she was conducting a witch hunt rather than exposing genuine corruption. Meanwhile, the counterattack against Amelia extended far beyond the Senate hearing room. Robert Sterling, despite his cooperation with federal investigators, had maintained contacts throughout the judicial system who were working to undermine the investigation through more subtle means. Threatening messages began appearing on Isabella's law school forms, suggesting that her grades had been inflated due to her mother's influence. Anonymous emails to her clients implied that their cases were being used to advance Justice Washington's political agenda. The attacks were designed to isolate Isabella professionally and emotionally, making her a liability to her mother's investigation. The pressure campaign escalated when someone gained access to Amelia's personal financial records and leaked selected information to create the impression of inappropriate judicial conduct. The leaked documents, taken out of context, suggested unusual income sources and spending patterns that right-wing media outlets eagerly amplified. "Justice Washington has been living far above her judicial salary," commentator Richard Hartley declared on his popular cable news program. "Where is this money coming from? Who is funding her activist agenda? The American people deserve answers." The financial records, when reviewed completely, showed nothing more than prudent investments in speaking fees from legal conferences, but the selective leaks created doubt about Amelia's integrity that was difficult to counter through calm explanation. Most concerning were the physical threats that began targeting both Amelia and Isabella. Federal marshals intercepted packages containing white powder sent to their homes, while anonymous phone calls described detailed knowledge of their daily routines. The threats weren't just attempts at intimidation, they were psychological warfare designed to break their concentration and resolve. "They're trying to make us afraid," Isabella told her mother during a late-night strategy session in their secure hotel suite. "Every threat, every leak, every attack is designed to make us question whether this fight is worth the cost." But Brooks had prepared more than legal arguments. His staff had spent 72 hours constructing a comprehensive attack designed to destroy Amelia's credibility through personal rather than professional criticism. "Justice Washington, this committee has received reports about your family's financial arrangements," Brooks continued once order was restored. "Specifically, your daughter's law firm has received substantial donations from organizations that benefit from your activist judicial philosophy." Isabella's face flushed with anger, but Amelia placed a restraining hand on her arm. This was exactly the kind of personal attack that Brooks hoped would provoke an emotional response. "Senator Brooks, my daughter's law firm represents civil rights victims pro bono. Any donations support their advocacy for constitutional principles that you seem to find threatening." Constitutional principles, or a radical agenda that seeks to undermine law enforcement and judicial authority? Brooks shot back. "Justice Washington, your investigation has caused chaos in federal courts across the country. Judges are afraid to make tough sentencing decisions for fear of being labeled racist by your task force." The accusation was false, but Brooks knew that public perception mattered more than accuracy. His staff had coordinated with friendly media outlets to amplify stories about judges feeling intimidated by Justice Washington's investigation, creating the impression that she was conducting a witch hunt rather than exposing genuine corruption. Meanwhile, the counterattack against Amelia extended far beyond the Senate hearing room. Robert Sterling, despite his cooperation with federal investigators, had maintained contacts throughout the judicial system who were working to undermine the investigation through more subtle means. Threatening messages began appearing on Isabella's law school forms, suggesting that her grades had been inflated due to her mother's influence. Anonymous emails to her clients implied that their cases were being used to advance Justice Washington's political agenda. The attacks were designed to isolate Isabella professionally and emotionally, making her a liability to her mother's investigation. The pressure campaign escalated when someone gained access to Amelia's personal financial records and leaked selected information to create the impression of inappropriate judicial conduct. The leaked documents, taken out of context, suggested unusual income sources and spending patterns that right-wing media outlets eagerly amplified. "Justice Washington has been living far above her judicial salary," commentator Richard Hartley declared on his popular cable news program. "Where is this money coming from? Who is funding her activist agenda? The American people deserve answers." The financial records, when reviewed completely, showed nothing more than prudent investments and speaking fees from legal conferences. But the selective leaks created doubt about Amelia's integrity that was difficult to counter through calm explanation.
Then covering up courthouse corruption. This is about preventing any meaningful change to a system that profits from injustice. The attacks reached their crescendo when Brooks scheduled additional hearings focused entirely on Amelia's pattern of judicial activism and disregard for proper procedure. The hearings were designed to create a public spectacle that would force her resignation while allowing the corrupt system to continue operating under different management. But Brooks had underestimated both Amelia's resolve and the public's appetite for real reform. Each attack against her credibility only highlighted the contrast between those fighting for justice and those protecting corruption. The more desperate her opponents became, the more obvious their guilt appeared to the American people watching the drama unfold. As she prepared for the next day's testimony, Amelia knew that the battle had reached its crucial phase. The evidence of systematic discrimination was undeniable, but powerful forces were working to ensure that evidence never resulted in meaningful change.
The outcome would determine not just her personal fate, but the future of civil rights in the American judicial system. The war for justice was about to reach its climax, and Amelia Washington intended to win it. The encrypted files that federal investigators discovered on Robert Sterling's secure server revealed a conspiracy so vast and carefully orchestrated that even Amelia Washington, despite her decades of legal experience, struggled to comprehend its full scope. The private conference room in the federal building had been transformed into an intelligence analysis center, with computer screens displaying network diagrams that mapped connections between dozens of federal judges, private prison corporations, and political figures across the country. Isabella Washington Santos stood before the largest display screen, laser pointer in hand, briefing the assembled team of FBI agents, federal prosecutors, and civil rights attorneys. Her voice carried the controlled intensity of someone who had spent sleepless nights connecting dots that revealed a nightmare of systematic oppression. The Manhattan Federal Courthouse wasn't an isolated case of discrimination, Isabella explained, highlighting nodes on the network diagram. It was one facility in a nationwide system designed to maximize incarceration rates of Black defendants for corporate profit. The evidence was overwhelming. Meridian Correctional Corporation had maintained financial relationships with federal judges in 12 districts, paying millions in consulting fees, conference sponsorships, and educational grants that coincided precisely with increased sentencing rates for minority defendants. The correlation was so exact that investigators could predict quarterly prison population increases based on Meridian's payment schedules. FBI Special Agent Catherine Rivers, a 20-year veteran of white-collar crime investigation, had never seen corruption operate at such a sophisticated level. They created an entire parallel justice system, she reported to Amelia. Black defendants were systematically routed to specific judges, assigned overwhelmed public defenders, and processed through predetermined conviction pipelines that maximized prison sentences. The conspiracy's sophistication extended to jury selection, where court administrators had developed algorithms that reduced Black representation on juries while maintaining plausible deniability. Bail schedules were calibrated to ensure that Black defendants remained in pre-trial detention, making effective legal defense nearly impossible. Even court scheduling was manipulated, with Black defendants' cases assigned to the most overwhelmed public defenders during their most busy periods. David Chen, despite his physical injuries, had become one of the investigation's most valuable assets. His insider knowledge of public defender operations revealed how the conspiracy controlled outcomes through resource manipulation rather than explicit judicial bias. They didn't need to tell judges to sentence Black defendants more harshly. They just made sure Black defendants had inadequate representation, appeared in court from jail rather than on bail, and faced judges who received financial benefits from high incarceration rates. The system produced racist outcomes through seemingly race-neutral procedures. The most shocking revelation came from encrypted communications between Senator William Brooks and executives from multiple private prison corporations. The exchanges revealed that Brooks's Judiciary Committee had coordinated federal judicial appointments specifically to place judges who would maintain high conviction rates in districts with large minority populations. One email from Brooks to Meridian CEO Charles Whitmore was particularly damning. "Senator, our quarterly projections depend on maintaining appropriate demographic balance in federal sentencing. The Washington investigation threatens our entire business model. We need judges who understand the economic realities of modern corrections." Brooks's response revealed his complete awareness of the system's discriminatory purpose. "Charles, I share your concerns. Justice Washington's activism could undermine decades of progress in maintaining order and supporting American business. We'll address this threat through proper congressional oversight." The financial flows supporting the conspiracy were staggering. Over 5 years, private prison corporations had channeled more than $50 million through consulting firms, legal education programs, and judicial conferences to federal judges and court administrators. The money wasn't technically bribes. It was payment for maintaining a system that treated Black Americans as a renewable resource for corporate profit. Chief Justice Franklin Adams faced the most difficult decision of his distinguished career as evidence of Supreme Court connections emerged. 3 federal circuit court judges who had been considered for Supreme Court appointments had received substantial payments from prison corporation affiliates. More troubling, the Supreme Court's own administrative services had contracts with consulting firms that traced back to Meridian and its competitors.
Amelia, if we expose all of this, we risk destroying public faith in the entire federal judiciary, Adams said during a private meeting in his chambers. The Supreme Court's legitimacy has survived for centuries because Americans believe we're above corruption. Amelia's response reflected the moral clarity that had driven her throughout the investigation. Franklin, our legitimacy comes from actually being above corruption, not just appearing to be. If the American people can't trust us to investigate systematic discrimination in our own system, why should they trust our rulings on civil rights cases? The investigation had revealed that the conspiracy reached into the highest levels of American government. Congressional appropriations for federal courts had been structured to reward districts with high conviction rates, creating financial incentives for discrimination throughout the federal system. State attorneys general coordinated with federal prosecutors to ensure that cases involving minority defendants were routed to the most punitive jurisdictions. Even legal education had been corrupted. Law schools received grants from prison corporation foundations that funded programs emphasizing practical sentencing and efficient case management, euphemisms for processing minority defendants through the conviction pipeline as quickly as possible. Young attorneys entered the system already conditioned to accept racial disparities as inevitable rather than unlawful. The psychological impact on Amelia was profound. As the first Black woman appointed to the Supreme Court, she had believed that her presence at the pinnacle of American justice represented meaningful progress toward equality. Now she understood that her appointment might have been partly designed to provide legitimacy for a system that was systematically oppressing people who looked like her. "They put you on the Supreme Court as window dressing," Isabella said bluntly during one of their strategy sessions. "A black face on the institution that was betraying Black people every day." The accusation stung because it contained uncomfortable truth. Amelia's appointment had been celebrated as historic progress, while the federal court system continued operating a machinery of racial oppression that would have impressed the architects of Jim Crow segregation. But the investigation had also revealed something else: the conspiracy's vulnerability to exposure. The system's sophistication required extensive coordination and documentation. Every payment, every communication, every manipulation of court procedures had left digital traces that federal investigators could follow. The conspirators' confidence in their untouchability made them careless about covering their tracks. Maria Gonzalez's audio recordings provided the final pieces of evidence that prosecutors needed to build their cases. Hundreds of hours of conversations between judges, court administrators, and corporate executives revealed not just individual corruption, but coordinated conspiracy to violate the civil rights of millions of Americans. The most chilling recording captured a planning session between Sterling, Judge Holbrook, and Meridian executives discussing how to maintain conviction rates while avoiding civil rights investigations. "The key is maintaining plausible deniability," Sterling explained to his co-conspirators. "We never explicitly mention race. We talk about crime statistics, recidivism patterns, and public safety. But everyone understands that we're managing demographic outcomes to support business objectives." Judge Holbrook added her own perspective. "Exactly right. I sentence based on established guidelines and precedent. If those guidelines happen to produce appropriate demographic balance in our correctional facilities, that's simply effective judicial administration." As the scope of the conspiracy became clear, Amelia realized that her investigation had uncovered the most extensive civil rights violation in American history. The systematic discrimination she had discovered wasn't comparable to historical injustices. It was the modern evolution of those injustices, hidden behind legal procedures and corporate structures that made it nearly invisible to casual observation. The evidence was ready. The network was exposed. Now came the most dangerous phase of the investigation, presenting the truth to a public that might not want to believe that their justice system had been corrupted by racial hatred and corporate greed. The Hart Senate Office Building's largest hearing room had been transformed into a judicial battleground where the future of American justice would be decided. Every seat was occupied, with overflow crowds watching on screens in adjacent rooms. Television cameras captured every angle as Associate Justice Amelia Washington prepared to present evidence that would either vindicate her investigation or destroy her career. Senator William Brooks commanded the hearing from his position as committee chair, flanked by colleagues who had spent days preparing for this moment. His strategy was simple but potentially devastating. Portray Justice Washington as a rogue activist who had manufactured a crisis to advance her political agenda, while positioning himself as the defender of judicial integrity and constitutional order. "Justice Washington," Brooks began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling powerful people. "You stand accused of the most serious breach of judicial ethics in Supreme Court history. You infiltrated a federal courthouse under false pretenses, provoked confrontations with court security, and launched an unauthorized investigation that has thrown the federal judiciary into chaos." Amelia sat calmly at the witness table, flanked by Isabella and her legal team. She wore her judicial robes as a reminder of her constitutional authority, though she knew Brooks intended to strip her of that protection through public humiliation. The packed hearing room buzzed with tension as spectators and media representatives waited for her response.
"Senator Brooks, I exercised my sworn duty to ensure equal justice under law when I discovered systematic discrimination in the federal court system," Amelia replied, her voice steady despite the hostile atmosphere. "The evidence we've uncovered reveals corruption that strikes at the heart of American constitutional principles." "Evidence obtained through deception and illegal surveillance," Brooks shot back. "Justice Washington, you have no authority to conduct criminal investigations. That power belongs to law enforcement agencies operating under proper oversight, not activist judges pursuing personal vendettas." The accusation was carefully crafted to resonate with conservative audiences, who viewed judicial activism as a threat to democratic governance. Brooks understood that winning the legal argument mattered less than winning the political narrative, and he had spent years perfecting the art of making corruption look like reform, and reform look like corruption. Isabella leaned forward, whispering urgently to her mother. "He's trying to make this about procedure instead of substance. We need to shift focus to the evidence." But Amelia had anticipated Brooks's strategy. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder containing the most damning evidence her investigation had uncovered. "Senator Brooks, I'd like to share with this committee some recordings that demonstrate the systematic nature of the discrimination we discovered," Amelia said, connecting a digital device to the hearing room's sound system. Judge Patricia Holbrook's voice filled the chamber with startling clarity. "These public defenders act like every drug dealer from Harlem deserves the same consideration as some college kid who made a mistake. We know the difference between defendants with potential and career criminals." The hearing room erupted as the implications of the recording became clear. Brooks gavelled for order, but the damage was done. Television audiences across the country were hearing federal judges explicitly acknowledge that they treated defendants differently based on race. "Justice Washington, the authenticity of these recordings has not been established," Brooks protested. "You cannot introduce unverified evidence into congressional proceedings." Senator Brooks, these recordings were made by court reporter Maria Gonzalez using court-approved equipment during official proceedings. They are as authentic as the transcripts she produces daily. Amelia played additional recordings that revealed the financial arrangements between judges and private prison corporations. The systematic nature of the corruption became undeniable as executives and judges discussed maintaining appropriate demographic balance in federal correctional facilities. Brooks realized that his carefully planned hearing was slipping beyond his control. The evidence was too compelling, too well documented, and too clearly damning for procedural objections to overcome. He attempted to regain narrative control through personal attacks. Justice Washington, this committee has received reports about your family's financial arrangements with organizations that benefit from judicial activism, specifically substantial donations to your daughter's law firm from groups that profit from attacking law enforcement and judicial authority. Isabella's face flushed with anger, but Amelia remained composed. Senator Brooks, my daughter's law firm represents civil rights victims pro bono. Any donations they receive support constitutional advocacy that you apparently find threatening to your political interests. The counterattack had revealed Brooks's desperation, but it also demonstrated the personal cost that Amelia and her family were paying for pursuing justice. Death threats, financial investigations, and character assassination were the price of challenging a system that enriched powerful interests through racial oppression. David Chen, despite his injuries and the threats against his family, had agreed to testify about his experiences in the Manhattan Federal Courthouse. His appearance at the witness table, his arm still in a sling from Torres's assault, provided powerful visual evidence of the system's brutality. Senators, I became a public defender because I believed in equal justice under law. Chen testified, his voice carrying despite obvious nervousness. What I witnessed in that courthouse was the systematic destruction of constitutional rights based solely on the color of my client's skin. Chen's testimony was devastating in its specificity. He described case after case where black defendants received harsher treatment than white defendants charged with identical crimes. He detailed how court administrators manipulated case assignments to ensure that minority defendants faced the most punitive judges and the most overwhelmed defense attorneys. Senator Brooks, he continued, looking directly at the committee chair, you ask about Justice Washington's conduct, but where were you when American citizens were being denied equal protection of the law? Where was congressional oversight when federal judges were participating in a conspiracy that violated everything our Constitution stands for? The question hung in the air as Brooks struggled to respond. His political position depended on appearing to support both law enforcement and constitutional rights, but Chen's testimony made clear that these had become mutually exclusive positions. Maria Gonzalez, the court reporter whose recordings had provided crucial evidence, testified via video link due to security concerns for her safety. Her quiet voice carried extraordinary moral authority as she described years of witnessing discrimination while remaining professionally invisible.
I recorded these conversations because I knew someday someone would need to hear the truth, Gonzalez explained. I watched judges destroy lives based on skin color while hiding behind legal procedures that made their racism appear professional. Someone had to document what was really happening. As the hearing continued, supporters of Justice Washington began arriving in increasing numbers. Civil rights leaders, legal scholars, and ordinary citizens who had been victimized by discriminatory sentencing filled the overflow rooms and spilled into the hallways outside the hearing room. The tide of public opinion was shifting as evidence mounted and the scope of the conspiracy became clear. Social media exploded with support for Justice Washington, while opinion polls showed growing approval for her investigation despite the political attacks against her. By late afternoon, even some of Brooks's Republican colleagues on the Judiciary Committee were distancing themselves from his aggressive attacks. The evidence was too compelling, the moral issues too clear, and the political costs of defending systematic racism too high for continued support.
Senator Patricia Mitchell, a moderate Republican from Ohio, broke with her party's approach during her questioning period. Justice Washington, what reforms do you believe are necessary to prevent this kind of systematic discrimination from recurring? The question marked a turning point in the hearing. Instead of defending her conduct, Amelia was now being asked to propose solutions for the corruption she had exposed. Her comprehensive response outlined structural reforms that would transform federal court operations while protecting civil rights. As the hearing concluded, it was clear that Brooks's attempt to destroy Justice Washington had failed completely. Instead of discrediting her investigation, the public forum had allowed her to present overwhelming evidence of systematic corruption that demanded immediate reform. The reckoning was complete, that the real work of rebuilding American justice was just beginning. 6 weeks after the explosive Senate hearing, the wheels of justice were turning with unprecedented speed and precision. The FBI raids that swept across 12 federal districts had resulted in 37 arrests, including judges, court administrators, and corporate executives who had participated in the nationwide discrimination conspiracy. The scenes of federal agents escorting judges from their chambers in handcuffs provided powerful visual evidence that no one was above the law. Marcus Torres, the bailiff whose assault on Justice Washington had triggered the investigation, faced federal charges for civil rights violations, assault on a federal official, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. His mugshot, showing a man who had aged years in just weeks, became a symbol of institutional authority corrupted by racial hatred. The military bearing that at once intimidated courthouse visitors was replaced by the hollow expression of someone who realized his actions had destroyed not just his career, but his entire understanding of power and authority. Judge Patricia Holbrook's removal from the bench came through a swift judicial conduct review that found her guilty of systematic discrimination and financial corruption. At 65, she faced the collapse of a career that had been built on managing institutional racism while maintaining plausible deniability. Her attempts to portray herself as a victim of prosecutorial overreach convinced no one, especially after audio recordings revealed her explicit awareness of the discriminatory system she had helped create. Marcus Sterling's cooperation with federal investigators had secured him a reduced sentence, but his detailed testimony exposed the full scope of the administrative corruption that had enabled judicial discrimination. His spreadsheets tracking incarceration rates by demographic categories became Exhibit A in multiple federal prosecutions, while his emails with private prison executives provided irrefutable evidence of conspiracy to violate civil rights. The private prison industry faced its own reckoning as Meridian Correctional Corporation and its competitors confronted federal investigations that threatened their entire business model. CEO Charles Whitmore's arrest on racketeering charges sent stock prices plummeting and forced congressional hearings on the privatization of American corrections. The industry that had profited from systematic racism was being dismantled through criminal prosecution and regulatory reform. Senator William Brooks's political career had ended on the witness table where he had intended to destroy Justice Washington's reputation. Evidence of his coordination with private prison corporations to influence judicial appointments resulted in Senate ethics violations that forced his resignation. His presidential ambitions evaporated as former allies distanced themselves from the corruption scandal that had engulfed his Judiciary Committee. The human cost of the conspiracy was staggering. Federal investigators identified more than 15,000 cases where minority defendants had received excessive sentences due to discriminatory practices. The systematic review of potentially tainted convictions had already resulted in hundreds of releases, with thousands more pending review. Each release represented a life partially restored, though years of wrongful imprisonment could never be fully compensated. Marcus Johnson, the young black defendant whose case had catalyzed Amelia's intervention, was among the first to benefit from the conviction reviews. The drug possession charge that had threatened him with years in prison was dismissed after investigators determined that his case had been processed through the discriminatory pipeline.
At 20, he had witnessed his potential future transform from incarceration to opportunity, though the trauma of his courthouse experience would require years of healing. Justice Washington established her temporary headquarters in the Manhattan Federal Courthouse, the same building where Torres had struck her just 2 months earlier. The symbolism was intentional. The seat of corruption had become the center of reform. Her presence behind the bench where Judge Holbrook had enabled systematic discrimination sent a powerful message about the transformation of American justice. "The physical building hasn't changed," Amelia observed during a press conference in the courthouse's main lobby, "but everything about how justice is administered here has been fundamentally reformed. We're implementing transparency measures, accountability systems, and civil rights protections that will serve as a model for federal courts nationwide." The reforms were comprehensive and immediate. All sentencing decisions now required detailed justification that was subject to statistical analysis for discriminatory patterns. Court administrators faced regular civil rights audits, while judicial assignments were randomized to prevent the routing of minority defendants to particular judges. Public defenders received increased funding and caseload limits that made effective representation possible. Isabella Washington Santos had emerged from the crisis as one of the most prominent civil rights attorneys in the country. Her law firm's caseload had exploded as victims of discriminatory sentencing sought legal representation for civil suits against the federal government. At 28, she was handling cases that would reshape American jurisprudence while dealing with the ongoing trauma of the threats and attacks she had endured. "This victory belongs to everyone who suffered under the old system," Isabella said during a ceremony commemorating the courthouse reforms. "My mother's courage exposed the corruption, but it was the collective action of court reporters, public defenders, defendants, and ordinary citizens that made real change possible." Chief Justice Franklin Adams faced his own difficult reckoning as the Supreme Court implemented new ethics rules and financial disclosure requirements designed to prevent the kind of corruption that had infected lower federal courts. His initial resistance to Amelia's investigation had been replaced by grudging admiration for her moral courage and practical results. Justice Washington's methods were unorthodox, Adams acknowledged during a private Supreme Court conference, but her results speak for themselves. She identified and eliminated systematic civil rights violations that we had failed to detect through traditional oversight. Perhaps unorthodox times require unorthodox leadership. David Chen's transformation from overwhelmed public defender to chief advocate for judicial reform demonstrated the human potential that discriminatory systems had been suppressing. His appointment as director of the Federal Public Defense Reform Initiative gave him authority to implement the changes he had dreamed of while struggling to represent clients under impossible conditions. Justice Washington showed us that individual courage can challenge institutional corruption, but sustaining that change requires institutional commitment to the principles she risked everything to defend, Chen reflected during a training session for new public defenders. The Manhattan Federal Courthouse had become a pilgrimage site for civil rights advocates and legal reformers who wanted to see the place where systematic discrimination had been exposed and eliminated. Tour groups walked through courtrooms where justice was now administered equally, regardless of race, while photographs in the lobby documented the transformation from corruption to accountability. Maria Gonzalez, the court reporter whose secret recordings had provided crucial evidence, found herself elevated from invisible functionary to recognized hero. Her decision to document years of discriminatory conversations had preserved evidence that made comprehensive reform possible. The quiet woman who had risked her job security to expose the truth now oversaw a courthouse transparency office that ensured such corruption could never operate in darkness again. As Amelia prepared to return to her Supreme Court duties, she reflected on the personal and professional costs of her investigation. The threats against her family, the attacks on her reputation, and the months of physical danger had tested her commitment to justice in ways she had never imagined. but the transformation of American federal courts from instruments of oppression to institutions of equal justice validated every sacrifice. Standing in the courthouse lobby where she had first witnessed systematic discrimination, Justice Washington looked up at the words carved in stone above the entrance, "Equal justice under law." For the first time in decades, those words reflected the reality of what happened inside the building rather than just an aspiration that the system had abandoned. The battle was won, but the war for justice would continue as long as people were willing to fight for the principles that made America worthy of its ideals. 6 months after the dramatic confrontation that had shaken the federal judiciary to its core, Dr. Amelia Washington stood in the morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the Manhattan Federal Courthouse. The building's exterior remained unchanged, the same imposing stone facade, the same carved words promising equal justice under law. But everything about what happened within these walls had been fundamentally transformed. The courthouse lobby that had once been a theater of racial discrimination now bustled with the energy of genuine justice. Security screening proceeded with professional courtesy for all visitors regardless of color. Court navigators, funded by the Federal Reform Initiative, helped citizens understand legal procedures in multiple languages. Digital displays provided real-time information about case schedules, judge assignments, and public resources, transparency measures that would have been unthinkable under the old regime. "Justice Washington," called the familiar voice from across the lobby. David Chen approached with confident strides, his bearing transformed from the overwhelmed public defender who had
once struggled to protect his clients from systematic abuse. At 32, Chen now served as Chief Federal Public Defense Coordinator for the Southern District of New York, overseeing reforms that had reduced average caseloads from 300 to 60 cases per attorney. "David, how are the new intake procedures working?" Amelia asked, genuinely interested in the operational details that made justice possible. "Remarkably well. Our attorneys can actually prepare for cases now, meet with clients multiple times, investigate evidence thoroughly. Last month, we achieved case dismissals or significant sentence reductions in 40% of our cases, not through legal technicalities, but through competent representation that the old system made impossible." They walked together toward Courtroom 7, where Amelia's confrontation with Marcus Torres began the investigation that transformed American justice. The courtroom had been renovated not just physically, but procedurally. Digital recording systems captured every interaction, while statistical monitoring software tracked sentencing patterns in real time to identify potential bias before it could affect outcomes. Judge Sarah Martinez, a Latina jurist appointed as Holbrook's replacement, presided over morning arraignments with the calm authority of someone committed to equal treatment under law. Her diverse staff reflected the courthouse's transformation from an institution that excluded minority professionals to one that actively recruited talent from all backgrounds. "The statistics speak for themselves," Chen continued, pulling up data on his tablet. "Sentencing disparities between white and minority defendants have been eliminated. Bail decisions follow standardized guidelines that consider only flight risk and public safety. Pre-trial detention rates for black defendants have dropped 60%. The numbers represented more than statistical improvement. They reflected thousands of lives that would not be destroyed by systematic discrimination, families that would remain intact, communities that would not be devastated by the mass incarceration pipeline that had operated under legal cover for decades." Maria Gonzalez emerged from a nearby office, her transformation as striking as the courthouse itself. The quiet court reporter who had risked everything to document judicial corruption now directed the Federal Court Transparency Initiative, ensuring that the kind of secret discrimination she had witnessed could never again flourish in darkness. "Justice Washington, the morning briefing is ready," Maria announced with the confidence of someone whose moral courage had changed history.
Her office maintained comprehensive databases of judicial communications, sentencing patterns, and administrative decisions, all subject to regular civil rights review and public disclosure. They gathered in the conference room that had once been Judge Holbrook's private chamber, where she had coordinated discriminatory practices with corporate allies. The space now served as the Reform Implementation Center, its walls covered with charts tracking the systematic elimination of racial bias from federal court operations. Isabella Washington Santos joined them via video conference from Washington, D.C., where she was testifying before Congress about expanding the courthouse reforms to state court systems. At 28, Isabella had become one of the most influential civil rights attorneys in the country, her law firm handling hundreds of cases on behalf of victims of the discriminatory system her mother had exposed. Mom, the Senate Judiciary Committee just approved funding for the National Court Reform Initiative. We'll be able to implement the Manhattan model in every federal district within 3 years. The initiative represented the institutionalization of the changes that Amelia's investigation had sparked. No longer dependent on individual courage or moral awakening, the reforms were being embedded in federal law, administrative procedures, and judicial training programs that would make discrimination structurally impossible, rather than merely prohibited. Marcus Johnson, the young man whose case had triggered Amelia's intervention, now worked as a community liaison helping formerly incarcerated individuals reintegrate into society. His journey from potential victim of systematic oppression to advocate for criminal justice reform embodied the transformation that was occurring throughout the system. I think about that day in Courtroom 7 all the time. If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't spoken up, I would have been just another young black man disappeared into the prison system. Instead, I'm helping other people avoid that fate. The personal connections reminded Amelia why the investigation was necessary despite its enormous personal cost. The threats against her family had subsided, but not disappeared entirely. Federal marshals still provided security for both her and Isabella, while their home addresses remained confidential. The price of challenging entrenched power was ongoing vigilance against those who profited from injustice. Chief Justice Franklin Adams had grown to appreciate Amelia's unorthodox methods as their results became undeniable. The Supreme Court's approval ratings had actually increased as Americans recognized that the highest court was committed to ensuring that constitutional principles operated throughout the federal system, not just in landmark decisions. "Your investigation saved the federal judiciary's credibility," Adams had told her during a private conversation the previous week. If this corruption had continued operating in secret, eventual exposure would have destroyed public faith in all federal courts, including our own. As afternoon settled over the courthouse, Amelia reflected on the transformation she had witnessed. The building that had once been a symbol of institutional racism had become a model for equal justice. The same marble hallways where black citizens had been subjected to systematic humiliation now welcomed all Americans with the dignity that democracy promised but had too rarely delivered. Justice had been served, but more importantly, justice continued being served daily through reformed institutions that protected rather than oppressed the vulnerable. The victory belonged not to any individual, but to the American people who had demanded that their government live up to its founding principles. The story of supreme justice was complete, but the work of justice itself would continue as long as people were willing to fight for the equality and dignity that democracy promised to all its citizens.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.